On the morning of September 18th, Mary and I headed to Williamsburg. The traffic was terrible, particularly in Baltimore. We passed D.C. and it was Fredericksburg before traffic got any better. On the approach to the campground, there was a turn onto a side street that crossed a railroad track. The track was very high, and I was a bit concerned that we would scrape. We managed, but it was not a comfortable place to go. We found our campground, got checked in, checked with Roy and Rosie, and they had stopped in D.C. They would be in the next day. I told the front desk, and it was no problem. Mary and I went to find the dog sitter just so we'd know where it was. The dog sitter was back down the road near the hump, which is what the high-rise railroad track became known as. We had dinner at a fancy all-you-can-eat buffet called Captain George that featured seafood. It was very good, but very expensive. We went back to the campground, washed clothes, and went to bed. We will spend the longest time in one place in Williamsburg. That is not entirely by accident, but not by design either. We have come 1,504 miles to get here. Williamsburg has many things to offer. There's Colonial Williamsburg, Busch Gardens, Yorktown Battlefield, and Jamestown. We have no interest in Busch Gardens, but the rest sounds promising. As it turned out, there are also doctors and Ford dealers, but more on that later. What is nice, that a dog sitter actually sits dogs on the weekends in Williamsburg. Not knowing exactly when Roy and Rosie would get to town, Mary and I decided to go on an excursion. We headed down the Colonial Parkway. The Colonial Parkway runs from Yorktown Battlefield to Jamestown. It is a limited access road through a park environment. It was very scenic. We ended up at the Yorktown Battlefield and we took a walking tour. Yorktown is where the colonial soldiers, led by George Washington, defeated the British for the first time. It was actually a very good tour, and the park ranger who conducted it was very knowledgeable. There was also a driving tour, but having taken the walking tour first made the driving tour even better. Along the driving tour, we saw deer, drove through lots of forest, stopped at a house where they would not let Sebastian in. They obviously didn't understand he was a service dog. We visited a cemetery and had to drive through a creek and across a primitive bridge. It was very interesting. From there we went to Jamestown. Jamestown was okay, but not nearly as interesting as Yorktown Battlefield had been. Of course, Jamestown is one of the earliest settlements. The residents had a very hard time for several years. In the museum, they had a couple of skeletons on display which they had excavated. We heard from Roy and Rosie, and they had arrived at the campground. Timing was perfect because we were on our way back. We had dinner that evening at the Olive Garden. On Sunday, Sebastian is going to doggy daycare. Daycare is on one side of the hump. The pancake house is on the other. Perfect. From there, we went to Colonial Williamsburg. Having a handicapped parking is very convenient. We bought our tickets and took the trolley into the complex. Everybody that works there is in costume and character. George Washington was going to speak, so we waited in the stands for him to do so. We took a tour of the courthouse where they placed a young lady on trial. I don't recall what her crime was, but she got convicted. It was a hard jury. From there, we went to the governor's palace, stopping along the way at the gunsmith shop. At the governor's palace, there was quite a display of weaponry. There were guns and swords hanging everywhere. Outside, we walked through a garden area and over to the kitchen where there was a display of food, but nobody could eat it. By then it was getting on into the afternoon. Mary and I decided that we should go pick up Sebastian and we would come back and get Roy and Rosie. It wasn't that Sebastian couldn't go to Williamsburg, it was that it was a lot easier not to have him. On our way, Mary wasn't feeling well, so we stopped and got her some medicine. After bailing Sebastian out of daycare, we headed back to Williamsburg. We found Roy and Rosie at the skits where the colonists were marching around giving the British trouble. The Patriots marched by, headed to a confrontation, and everybody on the street was invited to join. There was debris in the street similar to what was back at Assateague National Shore. It doesn't seem to bother them, they just march right through it. It's probably time to head home. We found a barbecue place for dinner that evening. On Monday morning, Mary woke up sick. She needed to go to the doctor. We looked up a walk-in clinic and chose one. Sebastian and I waited in the car while Mary waited in the waiting room. Just like in a doctor's office everywhere, it took a long time. Back at the campground, we found Roy nosing under his hood. He'd run the battery down. We'd have to make a trip to Walmart and pick up a battery charger. From Walmart, we go back to Yorktown because Roy and Rosie hadn't been there, and Mary and I were both perfectly willing to go back. That evening, we had dinner at a Thai restaurant. On Tuesday morning, it was evident that the battery charger had not done its job. Roy would have to go to the Ford dealer. Roy, Rosie, and Bo spent the day at the Ford dealership. I understand that Bo, with his halter and his leash, made quite an impression. Nobody had ever seen a cat on a leash. They ended up with a new battery, compliments of Ford, but it took all day. Happy birthday, Roy. Mary and I relaxed all afternoon and just read. There are train tracks running beside the campground. There are both freight trains and passenger trains. The passenger trains provide Wi-Fi to passengers. I know because they show up on my iPad. Tomorrow, we hope to get away from Williamsburg.